Good vibrations.
Propaganda by Edward Bernays, published in 1928. Chapter 1. Organizing Chaos. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of.
All right, so back for another installment, and this one is a 3-continent link-up. We're linking the US with Europe with New Zealand, and let me tell you, it's been a right bitch to arrange this one with time zones, but I think we've achieved it, and with a bit of luck on the line, I've got Jan Irvin of Gnostic Media, who is a returning guest to this series. Jan, welcome back.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Mark.
Okay, and we should also be linked up with Steve Outram out there in New Zealand. Steve, you with us?
I am. Hi, Mark. Hi, Jan.
Excellent. Listeners might have heard Steve guesting on the Gnostic Media Unspun podcasts. He's been on quite a few volumes talking about social engineering and mass mind control manipulation and all that good stuff. So I wanted to get the three of us together today to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love, 1967, and it's good that we're doing it now because there's not a lot of summer left. So I did particularly want to mark the occasion before the summer was out. And really, I wanted to just revisit that 1967 LSD-drenched mess. And I think all of us through our work have shown that that whole thing was pretty much the creation of the intel communities for the purpose of changing culture and societal values. So the fingerprints of the CIA were all over it, and certain other agencies as well. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that we're still experiencing the after effect ripples from those days in these times, 5 decades later. So I thought it'd be good to mark the occasion by revisiting that whole thing and looking at the legacy. I'm quite familiar with Jan's backstory, but Steve, maybe you just want to spend a couple of minutes telling us what first got you interested in this whole type of research and these subjects, if you can just give us a potted history.
Yeah, sure. So my background is in technology, specifically internet software. And I've lived in Silicon Valley since 2010, just recently moved back to New Zealand. And I got very interested in the Burning Man Festival. I first went to Burning Man in 1998, and quite a senior person in the technology industry suggested to me that I really needed to go, that everybody went there, and that was part of the key to becoming in Silicon Valley was to tap into these networks. So I became a huge fan of Burning Man, and I started a blog called burners.me. .me, and originally, really, it was a bit of a fanboy page. But I noticed that the leadership of the Burning Man organization, that they made some very big claims quite often, and sometimes they didn't check out. And as I started to fact check their claims more and more, I started to get a suspicion that there was something else going on here. And one day I saw an interview with the Burning Man founder Larry Harvey and Grateful Dead lyricist John Perry Barlow, which was done in TechCrunch in London 3 or 4 years ago. And a couple of things in the interview didn't sit right with me. And so I went and I Googled Grateful Dead CIA, because I thought I'd remembered, and reading conspiracy sites on the internet, that there are a few people said that there were some CIA links to the Grateful Dead. And that brought me in touch with Jan's work, and in particular his paper, Manufacturing the Deadhead. And as I was reading that document, before I even got to the end of it, I'd leaped ahead to start writing my own version, like, hey, this is exactly what's going on with Burning Man today. And in fact, at the end of Jan's paper, when I finally did get around to it, he specifically says that. He says it points right up to Burning Man. So we've been collaborating for a while now. We have a series, Silicon Valley Secret Weapon, The Shadow History of Burners, which is on YouTube. And we've really been exploring, the counterculture being weaponized as it is today, which, Burning Man is one of the main tools of that. But looking back at the 50 years of flower power, that started in San Francisco, and still today, San Francisco is the major generator of what's considered the counterculture. And I think that companies like Google and Facebook very much view themselves as countercultural companies, even though this has become the mainstream of civilization now.
Right. And I guess Burning Man is taking place in a couple of weeks. It's usually, late August going into September, right?
Yeah, it's Labor Day weekend, and so it's usually the last week of August, first week of September. It goes for 8 days in the desert in Nevada, near Reno, Nevada. It's probably 6 to 8 hour drive from San Francisco. It's quite a remote location, and Nevada is the state with the largest amount of government ownership. It's 85% owned by the government. And Burning Man is the largest event that takes place on government land in the US. And that's one of the key parts of the story, is that this is being done completely with the approval of the federal government.
Exactly. Red flag number one. There'll be many more. Might be good to have a very potted recap on how things led to the events of Summer 67, some of the major things that kind of set the scene for it and laid the foundations for that zenith of things when it all came to a head in 67. Maybe we should just think about some of the things that had, prepared for it.
I'd just like to interject about the Macy conferences. I really think that that's one of the key instigators behind the MKULTRA program and also the Summer of Love. And I guess leading up to the Macy conferences, it's very important to understand the historical significance of the Frankfurt School and the role that they've played in social engineering and also what they call now cultural Marxism. And it's the idea that everybody's views are equally as valuable, and so everybody should be accepted into society, which in the face of it, that sounds quite nice and inclusive. But what it means then is that the majority has to pander to the minority. The underlying idea of these cultural Marxists is not actually to promote well-being and a healthy society. It's divide and conquer, and to make us, questioning whether black is white and up is down, and really quite lost and looking for leaders, Pied Pipers that will bring people in different directions. And if you look at really, I think the entire modern music industry is kind of about segmenting people into small groups and then leading those groups through the Pied Pipers, which are these rock idols, the rock stars. I think it's no coincidence that when rock and roll music really first came to take over in the 60s, it came with the Beatles, and it was called the British Invasion. And it really was a British invasion. In the same way that the British invaded China in the two Opium Wars, they invaded the United States in the 60s, again with a drug culture and sex, drugs and rock and roll. It's a very Dionysian view of the world, and you can trace these underlying values all the way back to the ancient mystery schools.
Jan, maybe you want to speak on that.
Well, sure. Let's see. We had the conclusion of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and in 1947, I think it was April 13, something like that, the CIA is founded. And, they bring in the UK's famous, Aldous Huxley, and Gregory Bates and Margaret Mead were key factors behind the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. And beginning in May 1953, I think it was May 13, 1953, the CIA officially approves the MKULTRA program. Now, as far as the official version of history, which I debunked in another article that's part of the same series that Steve just mentioned from the Manufacturing the Deadhead, a couple articles after that, I wrote one, Spies in Academic Clothing, that goes into how the government really took control of the MKUltra narrative. The public had gotten word of it due to the CIA's murder of Frank Olson, and things really started to come undone under the Church Commission, and there were two commissions that were put in place to study MKUltra. What the public was told was a false narrative that it was all just about this. They had tried to create this Manchurian Candidate ordeal to basically mislead people as a limited hangout and get everyone to think that the MKUltra program was about this ability to hypnotize someone to get information across borders, etc. But upon further digging into it and spending years of research, I had discovered that MKUltra was really about the 60s counterculture. Now, U.S. intelligence such as the DIA, the CIA, the ONI, which is the Office of Naval Intelligence, British MI6. We have Canadian intelligence, Australian intelligence. They all played a part of it. The main orchestrators of this whole program was the Huxley family, and I've documented the Huxley family extensively. Aldous Huxley published his book, Doors of Perception, which appears to have been the first official book that was put out by the CIA and MI6's MKULTRA program. Now, most people think that MKULTRA was CIA specific. The CIA was really in bed with MI6. In fact, it's starting to look more and more like MI6 may have actually been heading it with Aldous Huxley and some of these people. But so what we had, and Steve just mentioned the whole music culture of the 60s and all of that. So we have this whole sex, drug, rock and roll theme. And I've done about 14 shows exposing the entire music industry, from rock and roll and rap and reggae and hip hop. I just did a show with Lennon Honor a couple of days ago. Mark, you and I did a show about 3 weeks ago exposing hip hop as well, going into the whole thing. So this is the underlying construct to promote the sex, drugs, rock and roll, in addition to violence and the breakup of the family and all of this stuff. So it was definitely an invasion by the British. U.S. intelligence, like I said, Canadian, Australian intelligence also involved. And the target was our own people. The CIA has really been in violation of their charter since day one. So this whole thing MKULTRA became the counterculture with these false books like Acid Dreams by Martin Lee, or The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John D. Marks. John D. Marks was the assistant to the director for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. It appears he may have later actually become the director of the Bureau. And so this was originally where all of the official narrative for MKULTRA came from. But through diligent research and fact-checking and spending about a decade plugging data into the brain database, I was able to see a whole different narrative begin to emerge around 2012. And in 2012, I also published an article called Gordon Wasson, the Man, the Legend, the Myth. And Gordon Wasson, for those who don't know, was the original discoverer of magic mushrooms. And he was a banker for J.P. Morgan, but what most people don't know is that he was the head of propaganda. He was the head of public relations for J.P. Morgan Bank, and he also headed MKULTRA Subproject 58, which the documents are available, and people had tried to play it down. In fact, Gordon Wasson had even helped John D. Marks write his book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, so that they could control the entire narrative on everything. Fast forward, though, this leads into the Harvard Social Relations Department with Timothy Leary under Henry A. Murray. Ram Dass is there, Dick Alpert. We have Thomas Chiu and B.F. Skinner, and Dick Price was there, who went on to later found the Esalen Institute with Michael Murphy under the auspices of Aldous Huxley and Gregory Bateson of the CIA and MI6 to promote all of these drug New Age themes out to the public. But the goal in this invasion, rather than mass genocide like in World War I and World War II, what they did was they packaged genocide in love with a ribbon and sold it to everybody as peace and love. So what they wanted you to do was screw and do drugs and run around with your titties bouncing around and hanging out, and then that was the new symbol of freedom rather than actual freedom. It was a shallow form of so-called freedom that was really just meant as a distraction to mainly attack the middle class. The main target was the middle class family, to break up the family, to get people to stop having children so that the elite could, run their eugenics. And Aldous Huxley's brother, Julian Huxley, the famous eugenicist, was behind a lot of that side of the operation. But all of this then begins to unfold as the 60s Summer of Love with Tim Leary. Tim Leary was CIA, as he admits, from at least 1962. It appears that he was CIA from probably around 57. He was running the Harvard's psychedelic project and the Harvard psilocybin project. And he admits that he was CIA running these projects.
I am talking to you, front of the fireplace. in the main living room of the Castalia Foundation. I am not speaking to you from a room of the 20th century. I am surrounded by objects and furnishings which would be more at home to a person from more ancient centuries, or perhaps from Oriental countries of the present time. A meditation house shrouded by pine trees, and behind it a meditation garden. This is the home of the Castalia Foundation, a center for research on the scientific and religious implications of consciousness-expanding drugs.
And then he goes out promoting sex, drugs, and rock and roll to the public. We have Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, the two pedophiles, and William Burroughs, an assassin and murderer, out promoting ayahuasca and the drugs to the public. And they package this stuff and travel around the country. Ken Kesey, the Merry Pranksters, all of these people, the cultural heroes of the 60s, were the CIA and MI6 agents that then launched the Summer of Love.
Ralph, the time has come. The time has come to go out of your mind. Are you ready, Ralph? Are you ready to die and be reborn? No. No, first, you must be in a state of grace. First, you must examine yourself in this mirror of confession. What do you see there? Your personality, all your goals and your fears, your little ambitions, the chess game of your life. You have to check that, Ralph. You can't take that on a trip with you. And then that other side of you, Ralph, that dark, unconscious, all those animal impulses which you hide and keep down below. All this baggage, too, must be checked. You can't take that on the billion-year voyage to God. Are you ready? Then take this chalice, the elixir of life, the ancient cup, the Holy Grail, the alchemist's stone of philosophy, the Holy Communion, the key to immortality. Take this and drink.
There was a documentary that came out last month, a two-part one from the BBC, on BBC4. It was called How Hippies Changed the World, and it was designed to mark the 50th anniversary of 1967. I don't know if either of you saw that.
I think you or somebody had sent it to me. I didn't see it, but it's in my archive ready to watch.
Yeah, I think I'd sent you a link to it on YouTube, which has since been removed. But yeah, this was on the BBC, and it was presenting the official version of what happened that summer. So, interestingly, they do mention Aldous Huxley. They do mention the Esalen Institute and Owsley Stanley and people like that, but they just seem to forget to mention the fact that the whole thing was sponsored by the CIA. That one just seems to have slipped through the net. So they're just presenting the idea that it's an entirely organic thing. It was all these hippies that got together and they had all these ideals and these principles, and they just kind of pulled their consciousness and brought about these major changes that the world is still feeling 50 years later. So, you know, that's the version of events that they want people to take on board.
Well, if I could just pick up again on my point about the Macy conferences, because they went for a period of about 15 years, and they brought together quite a strange combination of people. I mean, in the wake of World War II, we saw computers suddenly rising to prominence. So at the Macy conferences were a lot of computer people, John von Neumann, Norbert Wiener. These are the leaders of cybernetics. And this cybernetics is not just the study of computers, it's the study of how everything is a system and can be controlled as a system. But also at the Macy conferences were anthropologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, propagandists, social engineers, and obviously heavily populated by people with links to the intelligence community. And so I think that there was a twofold intention behind the Summer of Love. On the one side was the social engineering, but on the other side was the promotion of technology. And the 60s, basically simultaneously with the emergence of the hippie movement, we saw the emergence of the computing movement, which led then into personal computing. And looking at this with the lens of history now, we can see that when Apple really started to make their push, they had a big ad, 1984, and everything was black and white. It was these IBM people in cubicles working on their corporate computers. And then it was the year of the Los Angeles Olympics. They had an Olympic hammer throwing lady, came running through the ad, spun around, swung her hammer at the screen, smashed the 1984 vision, and everything turned into color. And then you have the Apple Mac. And what Apple did in promoting the Macintosh was these countercultural figures, particularly Timothy Leary, were held up as, you followed these guys in the 60s, they gave you a message of freedom and liberation, and now the computer will give you the same thing of freedom and liberation. And that led to a series of conferences in San Francisco called the Digital Be-Ins, picking up on the theme of the human be-in, which kicked off the Summer of Love. And then that's still going today with what's going on with Burning Man. And if you look at what computing really is, what the internet is, it's a giant net cast over the world to capture everything. And now we have Google saying that we need to merge our brains with computers. Elon Musk saying we need to get this neural lace and we need to connect to the electronic version of ourselves on the internet. And if we do that, we can live forever. Well, living forever inside this electronic machine, to me, is really conceptually no different to selling your soul to the devil for the promise of immortality. And how do you get humans to engineer the systems that will ultimately lead to their own demise? Well, basically, you need to distract them. And so in 1967, when the human being first happened, it was promoted as the gathering of the tribes, the two tribes, which was basically Stanford and Berkeley. And on the UC Berkeley side, they had this movement, the New Left, and that spawned things like the Black Panthers, the Symbionese Liberation Army, all these kind of groups that were quite aggressive. They were marching in the streets and they were protesting against computing technology. One of the signs was, I'm a human being, don't fold, spindle, or mutilate, which referred to the punch cards that were being pushed into the mainframes. On the other side of it, on the Stanford side, we have what I call the Stuart Brand group. Stuart Brand was the Army's most senior photographer. He was from the Pentagon, a parachutist, and he became the main countercultural figure behind the scenes, organising things such as the Whole Earth Catalogue, which became the hippie Bible. But his group saw computing as a way forward, that it would enhance humanity, it would make us better, and the purpose of taking drugs was to become better at engineering this technology. Whereas the New Left, it was more, political revolution is the only way forward. And so the idea was to bring them together into Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, to have a summer of love where these tribes could be united. And Timothy Leary, he stands up on the stage and he says his famous line, tune in, turn on, drop out. And that actually was developed 6 months previously in Madison Avenue by Marshall McLuhan and given to Leary. He tested it out on journalists. He'd even made a vinyl recording of him reading his turn in, tune in, drop out theories to people. And the idea of it was basically turn on means to take drugs. Tune in means to listen to what these gurus are telling you from the stage, Leary, Ginsberg and others, and then drop out. And instead of protesting against the government, against the Vietnam War and things like that, you're above that. You don't need to do that. Just drop out of society, go and live in a commune where you can have all the drugs you want, you can have all the sex you want, people can run around naked, and isn't it great, isn't it fun? And hey, here's all of these musicians and bands that are supporting this vision.
Yeah. And cybernetics was very much a forerunner of the current transhumanist fast march that we have, I guess. And there it was, the foundations being laid 50 years ago. You know, the plans that we're seeing play out now were being cultivated that long ago.
And even some of the people that were involved back then are still doing it today. There's an article I just sent to Jan that was in the Financial Times about Silicon Valley and microdosing. And James Fadiman, who's one of the MKULTRA doctors, he's there in Silicon Valley saying, hey, everybody should tune in, turn on, drop out.
Yeah, and James Fadiman, you know, he targeted me when I started to expose all of this, but he was actually one of the doctors at the Harvard Social Relations Department under Henry A. Murray, which the whole department was essentially a second CIA at Harvard. And so, you know, and I had mentioned earlier, Timothy Leary, Michael Hollingshead, Dick Alper Ramdas, B.F. Skinner, Thomas Chiu, all of these people were running out of that department. And then they would go out into the public and create cults, create religious centers like the Esalen Institute, like the Naropa Institute. Michael Hollingshead was given orders by Leary to go off to England and to make sure that, you know, because people in England at the time were just doing LSD for shits and giggles and not really, they hadn't gotten the so-called spiritual message. And the drugs cause hypersuggestibility, which I've written about in an article called Entheogens, What's in a Name? And so England was just taking them but not having the spiritual experience. So Timothy Leary gave Michael Hollingshead marching orders to get to England and give them the spiritual message and to get with the British media and bands like the Beatles and Rolling Stones to make sure that these bands were selling the official spiritual message. And then we see the Beatles coming out with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and all of this stuff shortly thereafter, which again leads directly back to Marshall McLuhan. And Marshall McLuhan was directing a lot of that. And so, you know, this is the foundation of that. The Beatles, Rolling Stones, these were MI6 agents coupled with the Doors and the Grateful Dead and a bunch of U.S. bands, which were CIA.
Let's get on to the Beatles and Stones a bit more shortly. But I'm just looking at a poster for the original Human Being right now, Saturday, January 14th, 1967. And as we just said, that pretty much kicked off the whole events of that year. For some reason, 1967 was deemed to be very important in terms of bringing a lot of this stuff together, and it all kind of came to a head in that mythical summer. So on this poster, you've got a picture of Leary in his Indian garb, and it's listing a gathering of the tribes, as Steve said. You've got Timothy Leary, Richard Elbert, Dick Gregory, Allen Ginsberg, and Jerry Rubin listed alongside all of San Francisco's rock bands, it says, including Santana and the Steve Miller Band. I think the Grateful Dead were involved in that as well. Maybe Big Brother and the Holding Company were. They seem to be involved in most of those events. So you've got figures from academia and the literary world rubbing shoulders with psychedelic rock bands. And basically they're all assets together that have been, you know, thrown together to further this agenda.
Yeah, and just before this festival happened, towards the end of 1966, there was a smaller festival organised by Stuart Brand, and there's some video of that available on YouTube. And they basically, they had some of these elements there. It was like the prototype, but they didn't have the bands. And it, you know, apparently 2,000 people showed up. But from what we can see in the video, it looks like really lucky to be 200. And so what happened between that festival and the Human Being is that they approached a promoter called Bill Graham, who is, you know, one of the main people behind the American music scene and certainly behind the growth of the Grateful Dead. And adding in Bill Graham, who, you know, he was selling out gigs at the Fillmore with these bands, suddenly they were able to get, some estimates say 15 to 20,000 people. Graham himself says 70 to 80,000 people at this free concert in Golden Gate Park. And I think that was sort of the key element, is how do you market this stuff to people? The religious experience isn't enough. The drugs isn't enough. Even the sex wasn't enough. But you bring in the rock music and the electric guitar, such a powerful force and sound when it's amplified. We take it for granted because I've heard that my whole life growing up in concerts. But thinking back to that time, and then you mentioned Bear Owsley Stanley before, who was like the sound guy, acid manufacturer, and financier of the Grateful Dead. He had a background in the U.S. Air Force. He basically left the Air Force before his tour would have been up and ended up doing this Grateful Dead stuff. But one of the things he did was create this wall of sound, these massive, massive structures of loudspeakers. And in fact, if you look at the UK, around the same time, it might have been 1968, but you had the creation of the Glastonbury Festival. And that same kind of wall of sound thing was implemented there. The guy's turbo sound became Function One. That sort of massively amplified technology has some of its origins actually in military acoustic warfare research.
Wow. Yeah, Glastonbury was 1970, I think, the first one.
Okay.
So the other big event of 67 would have been the Monterey Pop Festival in June, which was all the acts were curated by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, and it brought together all the key rock bands of that time, with the exception of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And I was quite surprised to find them absent from the bill. So you had The Who, you had Jimi Hendrix, you had Janis Joplin, you had Jefferson Airplane and all these other bands. I would have thought they would have made efforts to get either the Beatles or the Stones involved in that.
Well, I think a key point about that, Mark, is that the Beatles actually they broke up in before then. So their last ever concert was in San Francisco at Candlestick Park, and that's I think at the end of 1966.
True.
And in a way, maybe the Summer of Love was taking this operation to the next phase. The British invasion worked spectacularly well. But, you bring in the whole Paul is dead thing. Did that happen because of
exactly
the original Paul's resistance to the idea of LSD? But, after the Paul is dead, there's a turning point where suddenly the characters of the Beatles are very much involved in promoting drug use, including McCartney.
Have you taken LSD?
About 4 times.
And where did you get it from?
Oh, if I was to say where I got it from, it's illegal and everything. It's silly to say that.
Don't you believe that this was a matter which you should have kept private?
But the thing is, that I was asked a question by a newspaper. That's not the point anyway. I was asked whether I had or not. And then from then on, the whole bit about how far it's going to go and how many people it's going to encourage is up to the newspapers and up to you, on television.
But they weren't seen together on stage performing again, and it may well have been because it would be too easy to see through the deception.
Well, that's a very good point.
Yeah, apparently at that point, Billy Shepherd steps in, a.k.a. Billy Shears, and he takes over for Paul McCartney, who apparently really did die. John and Paul had been best friends, and then Billy Shepherd steps in, and then you see the rift in the band, and everything starts coming apart.
I think you need to do a Paul is Dead unspun show, Jan.
I might do that, and I've tried to get Thomas, what's his name, on the show, who wrote...
Tom U. Harriet.
Yeah, U. Harriet, and I've spoken to him, but, you can't get a single sentence out of him that isn't spin, so it's very difficult to, to have a conversation with the guy.
Yeah, well, actually, he doesn't do interviews, but there's a few other people out there that can speak on the subject, so that's just as an aside, but I've done many shows on Paul is Dead myself.
Yeah, that's right, and you kind of had taken over that, hadn't you? I think I had heard some of your shows on that, so maybe I should have you on again to do that.
Yeah, either me or maybe Mike Williams, Sage of Quay. He's done a lot of work on that as well. We did a show together on it a few months ago. So the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album was another key thing of that summer. That was released on the 1st of June 67 in the UK, right in time for that summer's proceedings. That certainly adds credence to the idea that the Beatles were British intelligence assets, given that the album came along just at the right time. And it also marked a radical shift in the style of music that group was putting out, with songs like, as you mentioned, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Within You Without You, completely fitted into everything that was coming out of California at that time. And who really believes that it's a coincidence that the Beatles' music started changing and going in that direction right at the same time as all the stuff coming out of California was going in that same way as well?
And then you have, Michael Hollingshead at that same time running off from the Harvard Social Relations Department to go manage all of that in the UK. So clearly it was being coordinated by the Harvard Social Relations Department, and that means that the CIA and MI6 were in bed together the whole time.
And I remember hearing a story, I think it was on one of your shows, about Tim Leary talking with Michael Hollingshead about doing an event in London which would be along similar lines of the human being. And I think there was some private correspondence that somebody had got hold of between Leary and Hollingshead. And in these letters he's saying, yeah, we could get somebody like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones to headline. And this implies that they're easily able to pull the strings to get those groups on board.
Right. Well, I published about that in one of my articles.
Right, that's where I heard it.
Yeah.
It's like an admission that they're all kind of on the same team.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you just have to look past the veneer and you can see, you can see the operation underneath. Go ahead, Steve.
I just wanted to say about the Rolling Stones in contrast to the Beatles. If you look at the origins of both of those bands, you had this sort of cultural movement, if you like, going on in the UK before them with these two groups, the Mods and the Rockers. And, one group was very nicely dressed in suits, riding around on scooters, but, violent thugs. And then the other group were these, like, crazy, dirty, disheveled, unwashed kind of ones. And you could see the Beatles and the Stones being positioned as the two sides of that coin, the Mods and the Rockers. And this comes back to the Hegelian dialectic, which is, you basically, to solve a problem, you create the two opposing sides of the problem, and then you create a synthesis of their views as a compromise, which was what you originally wanted to and intended to do in the first place. And the underlying idea of the Hegelian dialectic is that the state is God. So we need to destroy and attack the family unit and all other anchors that people have, so that the only thing they have to follow in their lives is the state. And the best way for the state to get people following them is to create a false group called the counterculture, and to say, hey, everybody that wants to rebel against the man, come over here into this group. And then when you're in that group, we'll divide and conquer you, we'll track you, we'll drug you, and we'll manipulate you.
Exactly. And we're understanding now how that whole thing gets done.
Well, and in my article, Spies in Academic Clothing, down in the conclusion, I discussed this very fact. I found a quote by a former editor-in-chief of High Times magazine, and he says, from Stephen Hagar, and he says, but that's the way spooks play their games. If there's going to be a social movement against whatever you're doing, it's best if you secretly create and orchestrate that movement against yourself right away, so that it never does any unintended damage to your personal fortunes.
Right.
And, of course, Stephen Hagar is one of the people that I exposed last September, and I think it was episode 38 or 39, Counterintelligence in Alt Media Part 2, and he has actually done quite a lot to try and spin my work and to bury it from the public, because he and a lot of these people who apparently are coordinated out of Triende Publishers were behind a lot of this.
Just before we move on from the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, I just want to take a minute to read out some stuff from this blog by this guy called Pinball King. He put out an article called What's Wrong with the Beatles, and he's listing the characters that are featured on the sleeve of Sgt. Pepper. And what's so interesting about it is that most of these characters, I think, have been exposed on Unspun at some point or another. But he's got a great way of expressing it. So he says, other heroes include 4 Indian gurus, occult mysticism, Carl Jung, occult psychology, Edgar Allan Poe, alcoholic horror mystic, Aldous Huxley, there he is, making another cameo, globalist eugenicist LSD promoter, William S. Burroughs, homosexual junkie murderer.
Let's not forget Burroughs was a pedophile and CIA assassin, too.
Yeah, we should put that in. Karl Marx, Satanic Father of Communism, according to Marx and Satan, by Richard Wurmbrand. Oscar Wilde, homosexual writer. George Bernard Shaw, racist eugenicist. Lewis Carroll, paedophile. Marlene Dietrich, decadent lesbian singer. James Joyce, alcoholic writer. Lenny Bruce, junkie comedian. H.G. Wells, eugenicist occultist writer. Terry Southern, obscene writer. Sigmund Freud, neurotic father of psychoanalysis.
And we should also mention that Freud was was the uncle of Edward Bernays, who then worked directly with Gordon Wasson promoting MKUltra.
Exactly. And he goes on to say there's also a doll of the Hindu goddess Lakshmi pointing as above, so below, Baphomet style, a hookah, drug bong, a purple velvet snake, serpent Satan phallic, Snow White from occultist Walt Disney, a Mexican tree of life, usually depicting the serpent Satan offering Adam and Eve forbidden knowledge in the Garden of Eden, and a Saturn trophy, son Satan, near the L 90-degree square. So I think he's done a pretty good job of breaking it all down there and putting it into context in terms of these heroes.
Surprisingly, though, you didn't mention Aleister Crowley, who I believe is actually on the cover twice, once a picture of him and once a cardboard cutout. But Crowley, when he was in the United States, one of the things that he was doing was uniting the various lodges of Freemasonry together to a new unified secret society, a reinvention of the Bavarian Illuminati. And I think if you look into the secret society connections of the people on the Sgt. Pepper's cover, you discover that many of them, if not all of them, were Freemasons or connected to groups like the OTO, which I see as just simply another branch of Freemasonry.
You know, and regarding Aleister Crowley, I had done a lot of research last year in Woodstock, and Aleister Crowley was on an island in the Hudson River called Esopus Island, where he was painting the rocks with Do What Thou Wilt. Now, about 15, might be 20, 25 miles away in Woodstock is the Maverick, where Joseph Campbell, the infamous fake mythologist, was there weaving his new religious historical narrative, creating a new mythology, a new hero's journey for the public. And then we, the Maverick Center is they were putting on, way before Woodstock, they were putting on these homosexual, transgender events, and people from all over New York would come to them. And then this eventually evolves into the Woodstock concert. Now, interestingly, the Woodstock concert wasn't actually held in Woodstock, New York. It was held a full hour away in a town called Bethel, New York. Now, Bethel means house of God, and of course that was the subverted house of God, which is actually Satanism.
Well, and I'm just a short distance here from the other Woodstock, which is just north of Oxford, which is the Churchill family home, the ancestral home of Winston Churchill. And then about 50 miles up the road, you got the original birthplace of Aleister Crowley in Leamington Spa. And then about 15 miles in the other direction, you've got Wadston Manor, which is a country pile of the Rothschilds. So I'm right in the bloody belly of the beast here, I tell you.
Right. Well, and people should be aware that Aleister Crowley was an MI6 agent, and it appears that he was really coordinating a lot of the efforts between the MI6 and the CIA and other organizations while he was amalgamating these secret societies under the OTO. It appears that he was probably doing the same thing with the intelligence communities.
And it's just a shame that he died in 1947, because I'm sure there would have been a key role for him in the counterculture if he'd still been alive.
Well, Timothy Leary, Leary said that he considered himself to be continuing Crowley's work, which was very important. So there you have another CIA agent also into the occult and pushing this countercultural stuff.
Well, I've been an admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think that I'm carrying on much of the work that he started over 100 years ago, and I think the 60s themselves. Crowley said he was in favor of finding your own self and do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law under love. It was a very powerful statement. I'm sorry he isn't around now to appreciate the glories that he started.
And then, interestingly, you get another figure, a guy called Michael Aquino, who is a military intelligence psyop specialist, and he came up with the concept of mind war, which a lot of what we see today in driving the narratives in the media is this concept of non-kinetic warfare, that social justice warriors, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, these types of movements, they're really driven by ideas and memes, and they can be weaponized. And Aquino, again, was carrying on Crowley's work and another military intelligence guy. So there's almost been 100 years of this going on now. And the other person worth mentioning is probably L. Ron Hubbard and the entire Scientology movement. Hubbard has many, many links to the intelligence community, and he was there with Jack Parsons, the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and one of the fathers of American rocketry. These guys are doing Crowleyite rituals in Los Angeles in the 1940s. They're trying to summon the Antichrist and to bring about the age of Horus. And these people and organizations went on to become very powerful and very influential. Is that because of the occult black magic they were tapping into? Maybe, but I think it's much more likely that they were all representing the intelligence community and all the resources there.
Well, so often when you look at the world of the military or military intelligence, you find connections going into the world of the dark occult. And then you usually don't have to look too far to find connections going into the corporate music industry. And people might think that these are three wildly separate worlds, and you wouldn't expect to find any connections there whatsoever. But, time and time again, you find that. As Steve just mentioned, Crowley and Michael Aquino were directly involved with the world of military intelligence, and they were occultists. And then, there's links going into all these music artists as well. So the connections are all there.
Just to interject there, Mark, I do recommend people study my series with Dr. Hans Utter called Music, Mind Control, and Psychobiology. But basically, the occult, which means hidden, secrets, etc., is the same thing as the intelligence community, roughly speaking. It's basically their recruiting grounds. The people that get into these secret societies, they work their way up, and they look for people that are excellent liars and manipulators and psychopaths, etc., and other specific qualities that make for good intelligence agents. They don't want people with a conscience, who might turn and expose everything from the inside. So they specifically need psychopaths. And speaking of which, Timothy Leary wrote the CIA's entrance exams, and I think and the test was called, in fact, the Leary, but what I think they were specifically looking for was traits of psychopathology.
Right. And we're given James Bond as this sort of public perception of what military intelligence is all about. This noble, gallant guy that's all for helping his country, and he's patriotic, and he wants to save us against dastardly villains and stuff. But the truth of the matter is that people think of military intelligence as the keeping of secrets to keep our country safe. But I think so much of it is the keeping of secrets in terms of the world of the occult and how to manipulate people on an energetic, spiritual and psychological level. And as you say, the people that they employ are very far from James Bond type heroes. They're psychopaths and eugenicists and people that want to do us harm.
The Church of Satan, is Office of Navy Intelligence. So was L. Ron Hubbard, whom Steve just mentioned. But this goes right into all of these different groups. And, very rarely do we see upright citizens being recruited into the agency, or agencies, plural.
What's so incredible to me is that we're discovering all this stuff now, 50 years on and plus, as we go back through the decades and work out how all this stuff was done, largely due to the opportunities for research that are afforded to us by the internet. And it's amazing that original generation hippies that were there in the 60s now have an opportunity to understand what was done to them, this massive number that was done on their generation. Of course, there's massive denial on the part of so many of these people. They don't want to have to accept that this nostalgic utopia that they've got such fond memories of was all contrived and didn't happen the way they thought it did. But at least the opportunity is there for those who have the will to want to know. And I think now we're exposing so many other connections between these other music genres like punk and new wave, heavy rock, electronic dance music. Then you've got movements like feminism, the LGBT, transgender thing. And, it can be seen that all these trends, all these movements, all these scenes come out of the world of military intelligence.
I agree.
I think you can trace this stuff back a long, long time, really for thousands of years, and through the ancient mystery schools. And, the secret societies like the Freemasons see themselves as recreating these ancient mystery schools. I don't know, Jan, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the rites of Eleusis and, what was going on back there.
Well, per the official Scaligerrian chronological version of history, which is probably false, apparently, and this is a pretty tough subject for people to wrap their heads around, but I'll just mention that it appears that the Dark Ages were fabricated and you can just delete out that 1,000-year period. Somebody who was actually the very first guest on my show, Professor Carl Ruck, who I later figured out was working with the CIA under MKULTRA subproject 58 with Gordon Wasson and Jonathan Ott and Jeremy Bigwood and some of these guys. He's the guy that created the misnomer entheogen, and I exposed how all of the claims that he uses to create that name were fraudulent. But he, working with a CIA asset and French intelligence asset by the name of Albert Hofmann, so-called inventor of LSD. I don't believe he actually did invent LSD. I think it was Arthur Stoll, his boss at Sandoz, who created it. But he and Gordon Wasson under MKULTRA Subproject 58, along with Professor Carl Ruck at Boston University, they manufactured this whole narrative or rewrote the history of Ulysses to make it seem so spiritual and something that we want to get back to and how it was so grand. But there were two families that were controlling the entire narrative called the Kierkenes and Yermolpids, and these families apparently ran the Secrets of Ulysses in Greece for about 2,000 years, and it was totally state-sanctioned and state-controlled. Sound familiar, like we're talking about now? And everybody in the society was required to participate once in their life. Nobody was allowed to talk about it, what was going on there. Even the slaves were brought in and included in that. But this was an early form of hypersuggestion, mind control, apparently using by what Wasson and Ruck and Hoffman claimed they were using an early derivative of ergot or LSD. So, apparently LSD, by what these guys say, wasn't invented then, but you've got to be careful of, everything that they claim. Like in my book, The Holy Mushroom, I've repeatedly exposed many of Carl Ruck's claims as false or misdirected, intentionally giving credit to the wrong people, etc., and taking it from other people. But this narrative seems to be there in ancient Greece, how they ran things. But when we delete this apparently false Dark Age, what we also see is that and Steve mentioned this earlier, the Dionysian mysteries were apparently running rampant throughout Europe up until about 300 or 400 years ago, and that this was when the Inquisitions really happened. The extra 1,000 years so-called Dark Age was inserted to cover up that the Inquisitions were actually 300-400 years ago to suppress the Dionysian mysteries in Europe, which were using sex, drugs, music, alcohol, etc., to cull the population, to keep everybody under control, etc. And then, the church comes in and stomps it out, possibly under the Grand Empire of Tartary, which was wiped out and erased from history. Tartary was a massive empire that ran from Europe all the way to the Americas. No, Christopher Columbus did not discover the Americas. People were here long before then that were part of the great Tartarian Empire. But, so this narrative in Europe appears as the Dionysian mysteries, and apparently because in Athens we have Athena and the Parthenon. Well, the Parthenon, that's from parthenogenesis, which is the virgin or virgin birth. Apparently Dionysus was equivalent or like a brother to Jesus under this narrative. When we, I need to flesh it out a little bit more. When we look at it from the perspective of Greek mythology, a lot of this stuff, I keep finding narratives throughout all of it that connect everything into Greek mythology, whether it's the fake chronology and Saturn worship. Of course, Saturn is Father Time, is Kronos, is, part of these ancient gods as well. So they all seem to center and pull on Greek mythology and Ulysses and all of this stuff, Dionysus, to sell this whole narrative of the ancient gods.
So sex, drugs and music as a cultural weapon is not something that just came along in the 60s. It's been done.
Well, no, I mean,
times.
if you think about it, Mark, what does Genesis 3 talk about? You have Adam and Eve eats the fruit in the tree, from the tree of knowledge, and then you have the fall of man and the swirling swords from the cherubim to keep people out. I mean, clearly this happened before, and the fall happened before. And in fact, I have quotes in my article, Entheogens, What's in a Name, from a discussion between Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary, discussing how they're trying to recreate the biblical fall and how it was drugs and everything that caused it. So clearly somebody, probably from ancient Tartary or wherever, was warning future generations that this had already taken place.
There's a fantastic YouTube that I'd recommend everybody interested in this topic to watch. It's called A Conversation on LSD, MKULTRA Reunion Party, and it's up on Jan's channel. And this is basically footage in 1979 of all of these key players of the Summer of Love, MKUltra, countercultural revolution, sitting back and reflecting and laughing about just what they did and how they did it. And everything is there in that video. These guys just completely confess to it all.
We were just remembering the first time we met, which was in Cambridge. We went out to this place, and Timothy then was wearing his grey flannel suit and his crew cut, and we had this very interesting discussion with him. And when we went, I don't think I ever told you this, Timothy, but when we went away, we both said what a nice fellow he is. And he said he's a very nice man, and all of a sudden it's very, very nice to think this work's going to be done at Harvard. He said it'd be so good for it. And then I said to Aldous, I said, I think he's a very nice fellow too, but don't you think that he's just a little bit square? And Aldous said, you may well be right. He said, but after all, isn't that what we want?
One of these days, I'll get the transcript up on the website too. It's finished. I need to finish editing it and post it.
Any thoughts on why this particular time period was so important in terms of what was done with the 60s counterculture then? I mentioned earlier that 67 seems to have been the zenith of it all. You know, it was deemed a very important time. I don't know if it was all about doing a number on the baby boomer generation, those people that were born at the tail end of World War II.
I think you just nailed it. I think it's very much centered on the baby boomers.
Why were they so interested in doing a number on that particular generation, do you think?
Okay, so you have the end of World War II, and then the OSS is shutting down. And then in 1947, the CIA is created, okay? And so then if you basically time it out from 1947 until 1967, and they launched MKUltra officially in 1953, you have 20 years there, 14 years from the kickoff of MKUltra. The baby boomers are just entering their teenage years right when MKUltra is kicked off, essentially. When the Summer of Love comes around, they're just entering their teenage years. So it all seems just so well timed if you believe in coincidence theory.
Exactly.
Well, the whole hippie era, as influential as it's been on modern consciousness even today, it only lasted a few years. And, by 1969, it was pretty much all over. And we suddenly saw this explosion of Satanism. We had the Tate LaBianca murders, often known as the Manson murders, Helter Skelter.
5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who starred in Valley of the Dolls, was 8 months pregnant and was found in a bikini-type nightgown with a rope around her neck attached to the body of a man.
2 bodies inside, 2 bodies outside.
Among the other victims were Hollywood hairstylist Jay Sebring and coffee heiress Abigail Folger. Authorities would allow no one in an unofficial capacity inside the posh $200,000 home in the hills overlooking Los Angeles. When police arrived, they found the telephones and electricity lines cut. The bodies had been dead about 12 hours. They were discovered this morning by a maid who ran screaming to neighbors. One officer summed up the murders when he said, "In all my years, I have never seen anything like this before."
We had the Altamonts, where the Hells Angels stab somebody in the head while Mick Jagger is singing Sympathy for the Devil, and the Rolling Stones are doing their Satanic Majesties Present tour. And that sort of saw the rise to prominence of the Church of Satan and Satanism as a popular ideology. Then following up from that, okay, so the kids, they had their little burst of experimental fun. What do we do with them now? In the early 70s, we see this project coming out of the Stanford Research Institute called The Changing Images of Man. Willis Harmon was the key doctor behind it, but he had hired Captain Al Hubbard, Captain Trips, who was one of the main LSD suppliers to the West Coast, as his special advisor. He brought in Joseph Campbell from the Maverick with his hero's journey idea of basically how to manipulate people using narrative. And then a bunch of other anthropologists, such as Margaret Mead, they were looking at a project of how do we socially engineer and transform society. And one of Willis Harmon's assistants, Marilyn Ferguson, wrote a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy. And the idea was that basically these hippies would get older and they would move into positions of power in the corporate and political world, but they would still retain these hippie values. And that eventually there would be 15 million Aquarians all over the world that would be able to drive society in whatever direction they want. And, I went to the last ever Grateful Dead concert in California, officially. I mean, they've been on tour a few times since then. And I was never exposed to the Grateful Dead growing up in Australia and New Zealand, but it's obviously been enormously influential on at least California culture. And what struck me looking around, all the people there, many of them appeared to be on LSD, but these weren't rebels. These people were doctors and lawyers and judges and bankers. And, basically that culture has become the mainstream, which was specifically outlined.
And I think the lesson that everyone listening to this can take away today is, based on the information that we've presented, you really do need to let go of heroes, because we've had all these cultural icons, all these heroes, whether it's somebody like Timothy Leary or Terence McKenna or Gordon Warson, or rock stars like Jim Morrison or the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, or somebody like Gloria Steinem, who is seen as the figurehead of feminism but is another CIA asset.
Yeah, and just on that point, I should probably read this for the audience. Maybe the UK audience hasn't heard this, but regarding Gloria Steinem, most people don't know that she was, in fact, CIA, and this is from the former head of the CIA, DCI William Colby, quoting Gloria Steinem. And he says, quote, "I might quote Miss Gloria Steinem, one of those so assisted, who commented that the CIA wanted to do what we wanted to do, present a healthy, diverse view of the United States. I never felt I was being dictated to at all," she said. So this is, again, the attack on the family, all of this stuff, but we see again that these movements are created and manufactured by the CIA and MI6, etc., and unleashed on the public, and they spin it as diversity when it's really an attack on the family. They want to promote homosexuality and transgenderism and all of this stuff, promote the less than 1% to dominate the 99+%, and to pass laws and quote-unquote rights. Most people don't realize that a right for one group is always at the cost of another group. So, gay rights with families, for instance, comes with, you have these sort of fake families where they're adopting children or whatever, and so instead of mother and father, it's parent one and parent two, and this kind of nonsense where they're trying to erase the foundation of society. And now they're even going so far as to, they want people to believe that you're born with a penis or a vagina has nothing to do with your gender. It has nothing to do if you're a boy or a girl. I mean, this is the nonsense spin that they're selling, and you have to be completely bereft of any critical thinking whatsoever to buy this crap from the intelligence community.
This is the boy who stole the heart of the superstar Sir Elton John. He met 14-month-old Lev on a visit to a Ukrainian orphanage and made this surprise announcement.
David and I have always talked about adoption, and David has always wanted to adopt a child, and I've always said no, because I am 62, and I think because of the traveling that I do and the life I have, maybe it wouldn't be the fair thing for a child. But after seeing Lev today, I would love to adopt him.
I think that they were trying to attack critical thinking and to attack objective truth, so that people have no idea, what's true or not, and that makes them very easy to manipulate, particularly with propaganda.
Steve, and I'm glad you brought that up, because today people think that truth is arbitrary and that you can't know truth. People don't trust their own five senses to look things up. They don't understand that whenever you see a lie or whenever you see a contradiction, it's always a lie or an error. And they'll throw their arms up in the air and they'll say, well, opinions are like a-holes. You can't know. But all that means, whenever you see a contradiction, it simply means that you need to dig further down into the information. There are no contradictions in nature, only in thought, only in our minds. And whenever you see one, you have to dig deeper. So I think you're exactly right. They want people so caught up in New Age mystical bullshit and quantum nonsense, and Albert Einstein is another one mentioned on Sgt. Pepper's. He was working with Julian Huxley at Princeton, etc., and another fraud, and quantum physics and Minkaswamy, all these people promoting this stuff. It's mathematical magic, and it's designed to get you to think that reality isn't real. You can't trust your own five senses to look things up, so you shouldn't even try. Let us tell you what you need to think.
That's exactly what it is. And with all these heroes and these cultural icons that people put on pedestals, nobody really knows these people. You get the public, the glossy kind of surface representation of them, the Wikipedia version of them, but we don't really know these people, where they come from, what their influences are. So, like I said, the only answer is don't have these heroes. Just be your own hero.
Yeah, well, there's very little preaching of morality and, positive values coming out of the leaders of today. And I think hip-hop is a fantastic example of that, as you guys have done in your recent shows. I mean, look at the values that are being promoted to people. Women are bitches and hoes, go become a drug dealer, and then you can go buy jewellery from Jacob the Jeweler.
Yeah, that's what it is. Just as we start to wrap up then, what lessons do you think we can learn from this whole counterculture psyop? I mean, we touched on that slightly there, but any closing thoughts from either of you in terms of what people might want to take away from this conversation?
I think that it's still going on today. Is really a key point, that it didn't end when the hippies ended. It just changed in form. And today we have Burning Man, been going for 30 years. It's very much an extension of the same things. In fact, Stuart Brand said that with Burning Man they have achieved every single thing they were trying to do with the acid tests and more. So it's just another version of acid tests, but there'll be something new coming along to replace Burning Man, and that may be out there today. I mean, I'm not so sure what the kids of today are into, but I think the point is that the secret societies, the intelligence community, the social engineers, this is their modus operandi, and the way they do it is divide and conquer, divide people into groups, give each group a Pied Piper leader, and then lead people wherever they want to them, because follow the leader, who else can you trust?
Well, I've got a section in my upcoming book, a big part of it actually, which will be out early next year, looking at electronic dance music, this massive worldwide phenomenon that we have. And I see so many of the same elements that we saw with the 60s counterculture just being rolled out for a new generation. So we're on the 30th anniversary of the acid house scene that came out of the UK, got going in late 1987, and that paved the way for this massive dance music scene that we've got absolutely everywhere now. And it's my view that that was another project of British military intelligence that was started with humble beginnings, and then it just kind of snowballed from there, and now it involves people, millions of people all over the world, in terms of the culture and the lifestyle that they adopt. And whereas in the 60s you had LSD as the drug of choice, in the 80s it was ecstasy, whereas you had psychedelic rock music, then you had electronic dance music, beats, it's the same template just being rolled out for a different generation, and it's tried and tested methods, and they just use them all the time.
and I think you can even go a little bit deeper into the nature of the music itself. That, if you go listen to live drumming, they might be drumming in 4/4 time, but there are slight imperceptions and differences between each note. Whereas with the electronic music, it's 4/4 time, but it's exactly the same every single time. And so I think subconsciously that's leading people towards this electronic, mechanized, computer-controlled society and away from more organic, harmonious versions of music. And you can link that back into the A432 hertz tuning, which maybe we don't have time to go into right now.
Well, it's a very good point. And any DJ that's ever tried to beat match a couple of old funk records where you've got live drummers, you take a couple of old James Brown records where he's got a live band, you try and mix those records together and the beat pattern will throw you off and you won't get the mix exact because you've got a human being doing the drumming, as you just said, and they're not entirely precise. Whereas you mix a couple of electronically produced records together and you can get it spot on because the beats are, exactly in the same place each time. So, yeah, good point. Jan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, and I have to completely agree with Steve that MKULTRA is alive and well. They probably have a new name for it. They claim that MKULTRA was shut down in, 63 or 67 or whatever, which is complete nonsense. It's alive and well today. It's alive in the bogus neo-shamanic, promotion of mushrooms and ayahuasca. People think that these things were ancient by the ancient shamans, etc. There's no evidence of mushrooms really being used religiously prior to the 1950s. Gordon Wasson manufactured all of that for the CIA. I've gone into the ancient Florentine codexes or codices, etc., and looked at the ancient Aztec reports, and there's a few spots that could be misconstrued that were spiritual, but there's 19 references to mushrooms in the Florentine Codex, and 18 of them are staunchly against their use, and the lewd youth and the lewd old woman, and all these references talk about how these people that did these things were degenerates and not to do these things. And then the Florentine Codex really looks like it became sort of a blueprint for this whole movement. And then today, we fast forward and you can't go a day or two, it seems, anymore without someone, promoting ayahuasca and these ayahuasca circles and how spiritual they are and all of this stuff. And you just need to take drugs, and it doesn't matter what's in the environment or what's in the vaccines or what's in the food or anything else, because you just need to be high on these suggestogens, these drugs that cause hypersuggestion. And none of that matters, and you'll just, meditate these bad things away. Reality doesn't exist. It's all based on primacy of consciousness nonsense. But aside from Burning Man, which is sort of the apex of the MKUltra program today, we see it widespread across the globe now with these ayahuasca circles, etc. And they'll use all manner of nonsense. We see the relabeling of these drugs as quote-unquote medicines. You got to take your medicine. You got to medicate to heal yourself from the woes of our culture and family and stuff like that. And, just go off in the jungle or get together with your friends, and then you'll be healed and you'll be cured if you just do this, ayahuasca or these suggestogens enough times. So while Burning Man is this yearly event that has really taken hold around the world, now we also have these almost daily and weekly events and these ayahuasca circles, etc., that are really the same thing on a smaller scale, and it's the same level of mind control, just, down to your local neighborhood.
Well, awesome conversation today. I mean, this stuff should be taught in schools, really, but I know it won't be.
Well, wait another 15 or 20 years and we'll be the dominant narrative. Don't worry about it.
I hope you're right, brother. We'll keep doing what we're doing. Do you just want to let people know where they can go to find further information, each of you, from your work online?
Sure. I'm at gnosticmedia.com. That's GNOSTIC media.com. And you can check out the work there. Please support the show and the work we do. We can't do it without public support. I also run triviumeducation.com, and I'm the publisher for John Allegro's famous work and his book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And I really got to give credit to him, because without him, we would have never figured the rest of this out.
You can find my work at burners.me. And also, if you go to YouTube and Google Shadow History of Burners, you'll see the series that Jan and I have done together, where we're really looking in depth at Burning Man and all its ties to occult and military intelligence and social engineering. And
hopefully Steve and I will get part 7 of the Shadow History of Burners done before Burning Man at the end of this month.
Yeah, that's going to be a good one.
All right, guys, thanks for coming on today.
Good vibrations.